interesting what we've seen with the consumers in there, but I'd like to get first your house view on the consumer space in Nigeria.
So we had a problem looking at that space about a year ago. We looked at it, we wrote a report, it didn't really fly, we didn't publish it, we tore it up, and then we went back to the drawing board. And first thing we did, we looked at the long-term sales growth of the listed companies, Nestle Nigeria, Unilever Nigeria, Flour Mills of Nigeria, PZ Cussons in Nigeria. And we tracked them over 8 years and then adjusted for inflation. And what we found was that Nestle was kind of growing 2 or 3% or so, a sort of a long-term growth rate. The jury was slightly out on Flour Mills. That seemed to be more or less flat in inflation-adjusted terms over the time. Unilever, the jury was out on that a little bit, seemed to be declining slightly, and PZ Cussons did not seem to be having a particularly good time. So when we measured that, we then said, okay, so if the population is growing at 2.5% per annum, which is widely accepted, and if urbanization of this country is taking place at 4.5% per annum, so you've got people coming into the cities, joining the cash economy, why aren't the food sales and the home and personal care sales of these companies going up at the same rate?
Okay, very interesting, but interesting space there, because when you look at that consumer goods space, 2018 wasn't a good year, particularly good year for that fast food. We saw the sector, the listed companies, especially, the sector was down about 23% last year. Yeah. Talks about the fact that there's been pressures with consumers in there and the spending power of Nigerians. Yeah,
so that's why we took a long-term trend, because there was a huge repricing in 2017. The sales of some of these companies shot up. Then 2018, reality came back, and they didn't do too well. In fact, in the last quarter, some of them did quite badly. So we took a long-term trend to be a bit more fair from 2011 through to 2018. But what we found was that you would expect them to be growing, but of course they're not, and on the whole, and that tends to be the problem.
All right, then very interesting, because it kind of brings me to an article I read earlier from The Economist talking about the fact that they were analyzing the last 4 years of President Buhari's administration, and in their view, they're of the opinion that Nigerians were a bit poorer in that period. Could this be what is playing out there with the consumers?
Yes, I think I wouldn't say it's Buhari's administration. I would say it goes back a bit longer than that. There's even some evidence that in 2013, 2014, the sales of these companies were not altogether going down, but they are readjusting to lower price points. We saw that in beer, for example. People migrated down from the higher price points to the mainstream brands, to the value brands. So I wouldn't hook it too much to the last 4 years or so. However, there is data. For example, we have a data set on an upper middle class group of 50,000 people, and the last time they got a decent pay increase was in 2014. They got a 0.2% increase on average in 2015, and then 2016, 17, 18, their pay goes down by about 4 to 5% each year in inflation-adjusted terms. I have to repeat that.
All right, but so now let's get into how competition in that space is, and how the different players are battling for market share.
So it's a real tough competition. It's really tough out there. So what we did to measure the competition, two of our analysts volunteered to create a fictional household called Mr. and Mrs. Ajayi. And Mr. Ajayi is a porter, Mrs. Ajayi is a waitress, and between them their disposable income each month is 84,000 naira. Now I know you're going to talk about infrastructure a little bit later on, so let me say straight away, a quarter of their income every month goes on transport. It just goes on transport. We've checked this across the board. Transport's hugely expensive here in Lagos. What that leaves them after rent and other expenses is around 26,000 naira a month for all their groceries and home and personal care. So we sent them out and said, try and survive on that, which they did. But what they came back with was quite surprising.
Interesting to find out how that played out in there. I'd like you to get into that as well.
So they came back with a shopping basket into our office. And first off, 70% of what they buy isn't branded at all. It's what we call nylon in this country, or plastic bags in other countries. So it's those black nylons with beans and plantain and pounded yam and all those good things, and fresh meat and fresh fruit, which you buy in the market. So only 30% of the basket was branded goods. Now, among the branded goods, there are some products from Nestle, Nigeria, Unilever, Nigeria, Flour Mills in Nigeria, and Pizza Cousins, Nigeria. They're all represented there. But there aren't many goods. There are more goods from unlisted companies like Daraju, like Limex, like Tolaram, and Duffel is part of Tolaram
Group, yeah.
And Olam, and companies like that. Now, these companies are unlisted. Some of them have been in this country for a very long time. Some of them have been set up within the last 20 years or so. But that's where the bulk of the purchases were.
I'd like to get to those unlisted companies and understand what their strategy and their play is for Nigeria, because we've seen some of the names you mentioned. They've been in Nigeria for quite a long while, and they're not even thinking of getting listed.
So that's a big subject, and you've just asked kind of one of the real key question, which is why isn't Daraju and Limex and Olam, why aren't they listed here? Of course, Olam is listed in Singapore, but why aren't they listed? And I think the reason is that they're just quite young in their cycle, in their corporate cycle, and they're focusing on what they do best, which is producing goods at very low cost.
But let's go on the listed companies. Though I see Nestle is kind of standing out from the pack there. I'd like to know what Nestle is doing differently.
Their key product is Maggi, which is a seasoning cube or seasoning sold in different forms. What's interesting about Maggi, it crops up in the market a lot. So Mr. and Mrs. Ajayi went to a street market in outer Lagos. They had a small budget, and they could only buy at the value end. We think tens of millions of households in this country are like that, literally tens of millions. Nestle was interesting in that their products are in the market. They compete head-to-head with other low-cost products. But also what Nestle do is they make products around their core brand. So they're variants of the core brand to keep people interested.
All right, then, but I'd like you to speak now first on what you think the impact of the new minimum wage will be, on those low-income households.
Well, we deliberately set Mr. and Mrs. Ajayi wages that are above the new minimum wage. So Mr. Ajayi is earning $37,000 per month. Mrs. Ajayi, as a waitress, gets $33,000 a month, but she gets another $20,000 with tips. So we thought that was a realistic sort of modelling of a small, childless household. Impact of the minimum wage could be that more people get into that bracket, so that's quite good news for these companies.
All right. Also on your report, I saw you talked about the fact that some international companies tried to position in Nigeria a while back and they got burnt. And I'd like you to speak to how you think, international funds that are looking to invest in that home and personal food space in Nigeria.
That's a very good question.
How should we look at Nigeria?
So it was very, very tough for them. I mean, there was a sort of a narrative about 8 years ago or so called Africa Rising. And Africa was going to go the Asian route and was going to industrialize, and people would, because it was industrializing and because people were getting more skillful, productivity would go up. People then would have better terms of trade, they would get richer, they'd move into the middle class, and the middle class would buy the kind of products that you see across the world. So a lot of money was raised, in places like London, South Africa, Singapore, to invest in listed consumer companies. And that didn't work out. The kind of growth rates that we saw at first did not sustain themselves.
Okay, one recurring thing I'm hearing in everything you're saying so far is that, in your view, you think that the average Nigerian consumer is very price sensitive.
Absolutely.
And I'd like you to get your thoughts on how you see this going, because across the classes, for the middle class, and then even the low income.
So I think there are possibly two answers to that. I mean, the first is the cash economy is getting bigger in the sense that you have more urbanization, so more people are coming in, but they're not necessarily, the people who are already there aren't necessarily getting richer. So I think we get more consumers, that's fine, therefore there's money to be made, but the consumers themselves may not be getting richer themselves. So that's one kind of important point. The other thing about cost is, you know, if you compete successfully on cost, you can make a lot of money. You know, and I think that's kind of a key thing. Looking
at how some of these players are, you know, their strategy in Nigeria, when you look at some of the consumer goods, I look at people like Nestle and PZ Cussons, I find that they kind of have this, they have like a key brand, and then they build other brands that compete with their own brand, even in the markets. You know, I set different prices in there. I'd like you to speak to that strategy and, you know, how that is playing out.
Well, look, I think they have, you know, as we said, when our researchers came back to the market, they came back with PZ Cussons brands and Nestle brands, Unilever brands, and Flour Mills of Nigeria brands. So those brands are still there and they're still strong. But the strategy of having a brand and then building brands around it will work, and it works in Nestle's case, but you have to be at the lowest end of the price point. You really have to be at the lowest end.
All right, then. Thank you so much for your time on the show. Interesting.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, we're trying to get more insights on Nigeria's consumer space. I've been speaking to Guy Chatteriski. He's the head of research at Coronation Merchant Bank.